Hey, hello, welcome back to J Hutch Talks Too Much. If you are just a little preamble here before we get going, if you are watching this video on YouTube and you like what I am producing here, please feel free to like the video. Please feel free to subscribe to the channel and to click that bell thing. I think it's a bell. I'm not sure. It's probably a bell. My mind right now, I'm thinking bell, in order to keep getting updates for when I put up a new show or when I'm going to put up a new show. If you are listening to the audio version of it, please feel free to rate and review the podcast. I would be very grateful if you did. This is a kind of a bit of a spur of the moment podcast tonight, because the idea just kind of occurred to me today as I was getting increasingly more and more frustrated with some of the things that I've been seeing online lately. I guess a lot of it stems from, and so I guess forgive me if some of this is kind of just off the cuff, and I hope that in some ways it's going to be comprehensible for you. But a lot of this, what I was responding to, stems from people who are responding to Noam Chomsky, because Chomsky has been, of course, being asked a lot about the conflict going on in Ukraine right now. And, you know, a lot of people like what he says. Certainly, you get people like Current Affairs, Nathan J. Robinson, who agrees with Chomsky, Ben Burgess, Glenn Greenwald. Those people all seem to be fairly ideologically aligned on this issue, but a lot of people are as always, upset by the things that he has to say. But the way that they're framing their critique of Chomsky is the thing that has irritated me. And I think it's worthwhile maybe investigating it a little bit. So what Chomsky's position is on Ukraine is essentially the same as the one that I articulated, me and Anders articulated a few weeks ago on this podcast about it. I don't think Chomsky got the idea from us, but nevertheless, I do essentially agree with what he says about it, which is, of course, that the invasion of Ukraine is illegal, and it should be condemned for being illegal. But at the same time, Chomsky acknowledges that it is inevitable, or maybe not so surprising. I'll take that back. Not inevitable, but perhaps an unsurprising consequence of NATO expansion, which was predicted as far back as the 90s as something that Russia would take as a sign of hostility and might end up sort of responding to. And so he notes the thing that Anders and I pointed out a few weeks ago on the podcast, which is that these actions have consequences, and the consequence of the NATO expansion has been that Russia sort of pushed this button and invaded Ukraine. So, but because Chomsky's been critical of not only NATO's role, but certainly America's role in the expansion of NATO, but also critical of the fact that the United States has not taken an active role in calling for a diplomatic response to the invasion, which would perhaps allow for some concessions to Vladimir Putin. And Chomsky believes, and I agree with Chomsky, that the central thing that we here in North America should be doing should be pushing for diplomatic solutions rather than solutions that will continue to escalate tensions and escalate violence in the region, to borrow the kind of phrase that Chomsky's been using to not fight to the last Ukrainian in order to combat Russia. Well, this stance has been critiqued quite a bit. Of course, as we could have probably predicted, you could cue the thoroughly ridiculous responses on social media, and of course they came. So actually, I want to share a couple of those ridiculous responses with you now. And you'll notice that most of them have very much the same character to them. So I'm just going to, hold on, show this collection here. So here's one tweet. Got to recognize that Chomsky has only one tool, hating America. I'm not sure if that's a tool. It's a very unusual use of the word tool, but okay. He has only one tool. Hammer, wrench, hating America. It all connects. Okay, got to recognize Chomsky has only one tool, hating America. He applies this tool to the man with a hammer, everything is a nail, to everything. Chomsky is not serious. He supported Pol Pot because ... America bad. Keep an eye on that phrase, America bad. You may see it again. Here's another one. It's the all or nothing attitude that doesn't fly. I'll correct some of the grammar as we go along. Chomsky, who I've respected enormously for most of my life, is now in the camp of anything America supports is imperialist and bad. Keep in mind, actually, I'm just going to stop reading this tweet for a second for those of you who are listening. This is a claim that has been made against Chomsky for decades. So it's kind of remarkably humorous that somebody's now saying, I've respected Chomsky basically all my life, but now he believes that anything America is imperialist and bad. Well, that's a charge that people have leveled against Chomsky going back to the 1970s, probably. It's just that this person happens to be, paying attention in this particular time period, I think. Okay, I'll start again. Chomsky, who I respected enormously for most of my life, is now in the camp of anything America supports is imperialist and bad. And while much of what we do around the world is terrible, totalizing takes are just broke. I don't know what just broke means. I'm not down with the lingo, but okay. So I'm sure a younger and more with it person would be able to understand that. Okay, here's another tweet. This is a response to another person's tweet saying it's genuinely scary how many leftists believe Serbia was the victim in the Yugoslav wars. But here's the response to that. A lot of this seems to stem from Noam Chomsky and other prominent leftist intellectuals. So this doesn't have to do with Russia. It's just, it happens to be a tweet that was put forward yesterday. Okay. Along the same lines as many of the other ones we've seen. The simplistic worldview of America bad that was rightfully used throughout the Cold War when criticizing American foreign policy was challenged by the better role that NATO, and there it cuts off, but I guess they believe that NATO played a good role. So once again, the simplistic worldview of America bad. Here's another one. This is in response to a Chomsky point about Ukraine. Noam Chomsky is what happens when the America bad type of liberal grows up and gets dementia, which is very nice. And then we have another one. Noam Chomsky's bad habit of essentializing everything to America bad means his foreign policy takes should be disregarded. Okay, so if there's a common sort of denominator in that group, that collection of tweets, and by the way, I just chose 5 or so randomly, but you can go and search Twitter, write in Chomsky America bad. You're going to see hundreds upon hundreds of tweets. It's very fashionable these days. I mean, it's a very old critique against Noam Chomsky, but it's now being characterized in this new way where they're summarizing Chomsky's whole sort of ethos as America bad. Now, in my humble opinion, I have paid fairly close attention to Noam Chomsky for at least the last 2 decades. And I can say, I think fairly clearly, that this is the most absurd reduction of Chomsky's argument that one could possibly make. Does Chomsky simply believe America bad? In other words, does he believe that the only actor in the world who does bad things is America, and therefore everybody else is doing good things? Because that's essentially what they're claiming there in these tweets, that Chomsky simply thinks that the only bad actor in the world is the United States. Is that true? Well, if you spend maybe just a few minutes of your life devoted towards looking at what Noam Chomsky has to say, you'll find that no, that's not true at all. It's just been a common critique against him. But in order to really explain what his ethos is, I thought that I would share about a 5-minute long video where he's leveled with this same charge in the late 1980s by, of course, everybody's favorite commentator, David Frum, George W. Bush's speechwriter, who makes the same claim that a lot of these people on Twitter are making, that Chomsky simply just focused on America being the bad guy. And I think that Chomsky's response here is instructive, because I think that what it demonstrates, at least to me, it demonstrates convincingly that the ethos that does underlie the way Chomsky approaches his critical look of the world, that ethos is, to me, the correct stance to take, or the correct approach to take. And so what I want to do is I want to look at that response now, and then I'll spend some time talking about it afterwards. So here we'll watch David Frum talking about, asking Chomsky about his politics.
You say that what the media do is to ignore certain kinds of atrocities that are committed by us and our friends, and to play up enormously atrocities that are committed by them and our enemies. And you posit, in fact, you say in the Massey lectures, that there's a test of integrity and moral honesty, which is to have a kind of equality of treatment of corpses.
Equality of principles.
I mean, that every dead person should be in principle equal to every other dead person.
That's not what I say at all.
Well, I'm glad that's not what you say, because in fact, that's not what you do.
Of course it's not what I do, nor would I say it. In fact, I say the opposite. What I say is that we should be responsible for our own actions primarily. That's something quite different.
But it isn't. But
Polish with 100 priests.
I wasn't equating them. I was comparing the treatment of them. If you want my value judgment, we should give much more attention to one priest who we've killed than to 100 priests that they've killed. Notice that this is exactly the.
Your method.
That's exactly my method.
Because your method is to ignore. Is not so much not only to ignore the corpses created by them, but also to ignore corpses that are created by neither side, but which are irrelevant to your ideological
That's
agenda.
totally untrue.
Well, let me give you an example.
Okay.
One of your own causes that you take very seriously is the cause of the Palestinians, and a Palestinian corpse weighs very heavily on your conscience, and yet a Kurdish corpse does not.
That's not true at all. I've been involved in Kurdish support groups for years. That's absolutely true. That's absolutely false. I mean, just ask the Kurdish, ask the people who are involved in, I mean, you know, they come to me, I sign their petitions and so on and so forth. In fact, if you look at the things we've written, I mean, let's take a look. I mean, I'm not Amnesty International. I can't do everything. I'm a single person. But if you read, say, take a look, say, at the book that Edward Herman and I wrote on this topic. We wrote a book about this in 1979. In it, we discuss 3 kinds of atrocities, not 2, 3 kinds of bloodbaths. What we called benign bloodbaths, which nobody cares about, constructive bloodbaths, which are the ones we like, and nefarious bloodbaths, which are the ones that the bad guys do. Constructive bloodbaths are things like the Indonesian massacres, which we supported. Nefarious bloodbaths are like Pol Pot. But we also discussed ones that nobody cares about, like Burundi. For example, we have probably the only discussion in the literature, I guess, of the massacres that were going on in Burundi at that time. We probably have the only discussion in the literature, at least that I know of the massacres that were going on in Burma, you know. Now, in fact, not only is what you say not true, but it's the opposite of the truth. We went out of our way to find the kinds of bloodbaths that are just ignored because nobody cares about them. Now, again, let me stress, I'm not Amnesty International. I do not have I don't have the ludicrous egotism which makes me the arbiter of all atrocities over the world, right? I'm not trying to give an A to this country and a B- to this country and so on. The principle that I think we ought to follow is not the one that you stated. It's the principle that we rightly expect Soviet dissidents to follow. Okay, what principle do we expect Sakharov to follow, let's say? What lets us decide whether Sakharov's a moral person? I think he is. Sakharov does not treat every corpse does not treat every atrocity as identical. He has nothing to say about American atrocities. And when he's asked, he says, I don't know anything about them, I don't care about them. What he talks about is Soviet atrocities, and that's right, because those are the ones that he's responsible for. Just as in, it's a very simple ethical point. You're responsible for the predictable consequences of your actions. You're not responsible for the predictable consequences of somebody else's actions. Now, we understand this when we're talking about dissidents in the Soviet Union, okay? But we refuse to understand it when we're talking about ourselves for very good reasons. Commissars in the Soviet Union don't understand it about dissidents. Commissars in the Soviet Union attack Sakharov and other dissidents because they don't talk about American crimes, right? We understand exactly why that's just hypocrisy and cynicism when they do it, and we should understand the same when we do it. Now, the fact of the matter is that I spend a fair amount of effort on crimes of official enemies. There are a fair number of people in the United States and Canada from the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe who are there because of my personal activities on their behalf. But I don't take any pride in that particularly. I just do it because I'm interested in it. The most important thing for me and for you is to think about the consequences of your actions. What can you affect? Those are the ones you primarily ought to be concerned about. Of course, every corpse is a corpse, but there's some that you can affect and there are others you can't do much about.
Okay. So, yeah, I mean, I think that that's a fantastic clip, which, again, to me, demonstrates the strength of sort of Chomsky's moral impulse and the fact that people can't even begin to grasp what he's talking about there, I think speaks more about the problems of the political culture than it does about Chomsky at all. In fact, it demonstrates to me what's right about Chomsky's take and what's wrong about most people's political takes. Now, if anybody sort of just pays a little bit of attention to what he's saying there, he's certainly not saying the only bad actor in the world is the United States and everybody else is fine. To take the example that he uses when he's talking, he's being asked at one point about, because he's talking about, I think he's being asked about the assassination, I think, of the Archbishop in El Salvador. But he says in that brief little moment, he says, I think that the moral thing to do is, let's say we killed one El Salvadoran priest, and they killed 100 of our priests. Let's say that's the hypothetical scenario. Well, if that's the case, we have a moral obligation to focus on the one. He's, as American, I'm not an American, so I guess I don't count myself in that group. But he says Americans have the moral obligation to focus on the one rather than the 100. Now, why is that a moral obligation? Well, to take the things that he says later, he says, well, that's what we are responsible for, right? We're not responsible for the 100. We're responsible for the one. Therefore, it's our moral obligation to focus on the one rather than the 100. Now, I'm going to expand on this point. I'm going to talk about it a little bit more in just a minute to explain, I think, in a pretty reasonable way, I hope, why that makes moral sense and why the fact that people reduce Chomsky's point of view to, quote, America bad demonstrates the poverty of morality underpinning a lot of people's politics. Now, I do want to kind of make two statements here. The first statement is, I think, something that I've probably said in several videos so far, which is that, I don't think everybody needs to be a political person. So when I talk about, what I think it means to do politics in just a few minutes, nobody in the whole world needs to do politics. Some people, they don't need to do politics. They don't need to be political people. There are people who have other sorts of strengths and abilities. And I would also say, again, as I've said in other videos as well, that I don't personally even really think that I am politically engaged in the way that I'm going to suggest what it means to be politically engaged. I don't think that I am. So this is in no means a way to pat myself on the back for doing the right kind of politics, because I don't think that I even do the kind of politics that I think is the only kind of politics that makes sense. What I refrain from doing, or what I try to refuse to do, is to do the thing that masquerades as politics and claim that to be politics, which I think is what a lot of people are doing. And it's because they're guided by this kind of faulty morality that also allows people to critique Chomsky for his particular approach. But as I say, not everybody needs to do politics. The other thing that I do want to suggest is to say that I do think that, my critique is not totalizing, to borrow one of the criticisms from Twitter. I do think that there are a lot of people out there right now who are doing really good politics. For example, Christian Smalls in the United States, and his work with Amazon, and the work that people who are working with him are doing, I think, is in many ways the ideal form of sort of political work. All the organizing that's going on at the various Starbucks, where people are organizing into unions for the first time, is sort of genuine, strong, effective political work. Also, I in terms of this kind of effective political work, I've talked a little bit about this before, but I'm gonna show this again. It's actually from a different interview than the one I've quoted from before, but this is Chris Hedges talking about some of the political work that he sees going on sort of firsthand. This is in many ways, there's a bit of a preamble, which I'm going to keep because I think that it's crucial. But I'm gonna keep it, and I'll refer back to it in a little bit. But again, this is Hedges talking about, I think, about a lot of the valuable political work that's going on in the United States right now that has virtually nothing to do with the things that are being done on social media, which is almost overwhelmingly and totally non-productive, non-political work that by and large, in my opinion, works to undermine the serious, legitimate political work that's done by the people that I have mentioned already, and the people that Christopher Hedges is about to talk about. And I do just want to show this. I'm going to put my volume down again one more time. So allow for 1 second again while I start up the video. Oh, and just to preface this, it begins with, I think he's on Kyle Kulinski and Crystal Ball's show. He's asked about whether or not, what should be the limits of the populist left, Kulinski asks, in terms of engaging with a populist right in order to expand the tent. So this is Hedges' response. So give me just a quick second here to set up the video.
There is no populist left. The populist left has retreated into a boutique kind of activism around identity politics and woke culture and Maoist kind of control of speech and mistaken that for politics. That's anti-politics. So the left is committing suicide. In terms of the populist right, I think that the only hope is to build alliances, and you're right that is the solution, to build in terms of re-empowering a disenfranchised working class, is to build alliances around specific issues. For instance, the Kellogg strike, the attempt to unionize Walmart or Amazon. It's interesting. I've taught now in the prison, and I know Crystal's looked at my new book about this for over a decade. So I'm finally getting these students who are brilliant students. This is through Rutgers. So they get their college degree. A lot of my students graduate summa cum laude, which is hard enough at Rutgers, but imagine doing that from a prison cell. What I've seen is that students who maintain a 3.1 average are allowed to matriculate and finish their degree at Rutgers. And a lot of my students have been involved, and they're almost all Black, have been involved in organizing the service workers at Rutgers, a lot of whom are white and a lot of whom are Trump supporters. And that is really, and I think that, the point you raised is a good one. That is really where we have to go. And Lord Salisbury, who was a piece of work, used to say there are no permanent allies. There's only permanent power. So on specific issues, yes, we do have to build an alliance with people who don't think like us. When I sued Obama in 2012 over Section 1021 of the National Defense Authorization Act, which overturned the 1878 Posse Comitatus Act, which prohibits the military from being used as a domestic police force, we were joined in amicus briefs by a lot of libertarian groups. Very right-wing libertarian groups, and we accepted those amicus briefs so that it was a united front, along with Noam Chomsky and Daniel Ellsberg and others.
Okay, so that to me is an example of sort of positive political work. If you want another example of positive political work, the kind of political work that people like Noam Chomsky has done, like somebody who has used their voice, their popularity, and their platform to call attention to the bad things that his government is doing as a way to try to build a movement in order to organize people, something that they can organize around, give people a discourse and information that they can build a movement around, right? That to me is very positive political work. But so much of today's political work, and again, I'm not even necessarily saying that this is unique. It's unique in the sense that so much of it is going on online. So much of it, this is what characterizes so much of social media activism, for want of a better word, because it's not really activism, but nevertheless, it's what characterizes a lot of it. So much of it, it basically amounts to this. This is a representative example that I've thought of. When somebody brings up Woody Allen in a conversation, they go, "Ugh." That's basically the extent of their politics. I saw Annie Hall last night. And that's it. They'll do that for a variety of different people and topics and issues, but that to them is what doing politics is. Hey, I saw Broadway Danny Rose. That's it. That's politics, because so much of politics, or what passes for politics, is about having what Chomsky calls, in that David Frum discussion, the ludicrous egotism that makes us the arbiter over all actions. And it's not about being responsible for the predictable consequences of our own actions, right? So we see politics as calling out what other people are doing wrong. It's about pointing out how, hey, that other guy, that's the bad guy, and they should stop what it is that they're doing, right? What's much harder is, in fact, to look into the mirror and to see what it is that we ourselves are doing. It's also much less gratifying. It feels good, for example, when we can tweet out that someone is a racist or a misogynist or a transphobe. And I'm not, of course, there are plenty of people out there that are racists and that are misogynists and they are transphobes, right? But it's to call them out for doing it. It's not doing politics, or to use another kind of common phrase of the day, it's being a good ally, right? Okay, sure. It's, is it doing anything to materially help their lives? No, and in fact, if it is about, masquerading as something as masquerading as politics, so people feel they've done their job, that they've put in their political effort so that they don't have to do anything more serious, which might actually entail helping oppressed people be less oppressed, doing the hard work that might actually make them less oppressed, right? If, simply calling out other actions to us constitutes all we really need to do in order to, make a difference in the world, then in fact, it might actually be hurting them because it's preventing us from doing the real hard work that could actually materially affect their lives in a positive way. So if that's, I don't know how that's being an ally, but that's, what we call being an ally. But, like I said, it makes us feel good to do those kinds of things. It doesn't feel as good when somebody says to us that we are responsible for the disenfranchisement of entire countries' population. Like, for example, when we participate in the overthrowing of a democratically elected regime of some country, so that we're responsible for that, and potentially the thousands of deaths that come out as a consequence of that. If somebody says that we're responsible for that, that doesn't make us feel good. So, why would I participate in that? Why would I want to call attention to that? Moreover, because it doesn't feel as good, I'm going to invent all sorts of reasons to avoid doing it, right? Like we call out people like Noam Chomsky, who does call attention to the things he feels responsible for. And we say, well, Noam Chomsky's not objective, right? And that's bad. He's not being objective, right? He doesn't say, as Fromm says, that every corpse is the same, is equal. Therefore, he's not objective and that's bad. Therefore, I'm going to do the right thing. I'm going to be the good person who is objective. And therefore, I'll spend the lion's share of my attention calling out the things that I have no responsibility for and no chance of stopping. And I'll spend comparatively no time whatsoever concentrating on the things that are my responsibility and that I could potentially stop. And that's the right thing to do. Right? The right thing to do is to pay very little attention to the things that I can stop and pay as much attention as I can to talking about things that I can't stop at all. That's the right thing to do because that's objective. Well, it doesn't take much when you think about it that way. I don't think it takes much for a rational thinking person to see within seconds how this position is supremely idiotic at best and at worst totally irresponsible. But I do think that a lot of people are using that reasoning to mask the fact that they are shirking their responsibility, as does the fact that there's currently a huge motivator, namely social acceptability, right? So if I call out other people's behavior online, I can get a lot of likes, right? Within a particular kind of community, that's a praiseworthy thing to do. Right, so there's a kind of certainly a big social motivator to do it. So yeah, it's an easy thing to do. It's one of the easiest things to do, right? To point out somebody who's a racist, call them a racist, and get a lot of likes for it, and that's political work. That's doing politics. So there's also another factor too, which is that we're in many ways ideologically driven to not consider the bad things that people do in our name. We are ideologically driven to look at the bad things that other people do, right? That's just historically always been the case, right? That's the reason why when the United States invaded Iraq, there was virtually no discussion in the mainstream about the close relationship that the United States and Iraq had during the early 1980s, right? Because it's just, just out of the sort of outside of the ideological limits. We're ideologically driven to only talk about the bad things that other people do and not talk about us, right? That's the information that we see on a day-to-day basis. So there's all sorts of reasons why we wouldn't do it. But again, it's kind of amusing that when somebody like Chomsky does decide that, okay, I'm going to talk about the things that I'm responsible for, that it gets characterized as America bad. However, I also think that another issue is the fact that people have such a poor understanding of what democracy means, that they literally don't feel that they have a responsibility for the actions that are undertaken by their government, right? So, if as I said, a couple minutes ago, if somebody accuses me, let's say, of being responsible for the disenfranchisement of the entire population of a country because Canada participated in the overthrow of their democracy, or because they funded a military coup that took place there. Maybe they weren't the only ones to fund it, but they were among the funders of a military coup that took place. And then somebody says to me, just some ordinary Joe, that you're responsible for that disenfranchisement of the country. I think a lot of people would probably say, well, why am I responsible for it? It was the Canadian government that put money into that military junta that overthrew the government. It wasn't me who did it. But again, that is stemming from, that's a consequence of a really remarkably poor understanding of what it means to live in a democracy, or what democracy literally means. And again, we are sort of ideologically shaped in order to take that stance, right? We believe that the only thing we need to do in order to participate in a democracy is to vote every couple of years. That's literally the least you could do in order to participate in a democracy. And so, again, one could also easily say things like, well, I didn't vote for that person, so it's not my fault. I did what I could do, but I didn't vote for them and they did the bad thing. But here's my perspective. And I kind of recognize that maybe there are other people who have other perspectives on this, so I'm eager to hear them. But my perspective is this. We have a provincial election coming up. I live in Ontario, and we have an election in Canada, for those of you who are my international listeners. And I know I have some because you emailed me last night. For those of you who don't know, we do have an election coming up here in a few weeks, a little over a week. Doesn't matter when. Anyway, I'm pre-recording this, so I'm not exactly sure when it's going to be. But we have an election coming up in Ontario. And one of the people up for the election, he's been the premier, is Doug Ford for the Conservative Party. I'm not personally a fan of Doug Ford. I've never voted for Doug Ford. I'm quite certain I never will vote for Doug Ford. But here's my perspective. If you've spent the last couple of years, say, hypothetically, going on Twitter and every single day writing something bad about Doug Ford, about how terrible he is, in my opinion, you are just as responsible, or about as responsible, for everything that Ford has done as the person who goes on Twitter every day and says supportive things of him and votes for him, right? You're both virtually equally responsible for the actions that Ford has done. Well, why is that? Well, the reason why is because in a functioning democracy, the power is genuinely entirely in the hands of the people. And it is always within our power to control, in a democratic system, what the people in power do. Therefore, if we don't like what Doug Ford is doing, then we need to organize ourselves and put pressure on the government until they change. And again, this has to do with understanding that we are responsible for the things that we can do, for the predictable consequences of our actions, which, again, a lot of people don't like to do because, of course, once again, what is easier? To help organize the public, to organize them in a way that they are powerful enough and influential enough to shape the kinds of things that our government does, or at least try to do something like that and potentially fail? Is it easier to do that? Or is it easier to simply say, those stupid people who voted for them, it's their fault that we are where we are, right? Again, we don't like to recognize our own responsibility. So we cloak it in a veil of moral superiority, right? We are the moral arbiter where we could say, we are the good ones, they are the bad ones, it's their fault that we are where we are, and I can just sit back and shake my head at all the bad people who have done the bad things. Well, that again is not acting politically, but it's then, it's a very common thing for people to do. And in my opinion, it's not surprising that in this atmosphere where this mindset is so dominant, that people will so easily dismiss Chomsky's take on morality. So my thinking essentially is this, that you don't necessarily have to agree with what it is that Chomsky is saying, which, to summarize, that if you are a moral thinking person, if you are acting in a moral way, then you are recognizing the things that you are responsible for. Well, let's put this in another way. If you're both a moral thinking person and a political person, then you have a moral responsibility to focus on the things that you are responsible for, the things that you can control, right? Not the things that other people are responsible for and that they can control, right? To give he mentions this at the end of that From excerpt, but he does something similar in other interviews where he said, we can, if we wanted to, we can talk about how terrible Genghis Khan was, all the terrible things that Genghis Khan did. Yeah, we can talk about it. Now, what does that change by calling out Genghis Khan's bad actions, bad political acts, and the terrible things that he did? What does that change? Well, it changes exactly nothing, because all of those incidents happened. They're in the past. We can't bring back the dead. We can't do any of those things. So how moral is it for us to comment on Genghis Khan's actions? Well, it's not moral at all. What it does is it makes us feel very good for being able to talk about how bad somebody else was, right? Because it points out how good we are, right? I'm so good that I can say that what Genghis Khan did was wrong, because I have a degree of moral superiority and a higher sense of what the right thing to do is, that I can call out Genghis Khan's bad actions. Does it save anybody's lives? No. Does it help anybody? No. What does it do? It just makes me feel good. It makes me look good for being able to call out those things. So that's not moral in any way. Chomsky says the only thing to do the thing to do that is moral is to pay attention to the things that you have some kind of control over, which is why his philosophy is not in any sense America bad, but his philosophy is, I live in America. America is a democratic country that is receptive to the whims of its people. And therefore, I have a responsibility for focusing on the things that they do rather than the things that other people do. Yes, of course, it's true. It's quite possible that there are other countries that could very well do terrible things. There's a possibility that in some ways they might do something worse. And therefore, it's up to the people who live there to critique the things that are happening within their own country in order to stop it. There's very little that Chomsky says that he can do in order to stop those things, because after all, as he says, I'm not Amnesty International. That is, at least to him, what it means to act morally. Now, you can take issue with that. I think that it's fair for people who hear that point of view to say, well, no, I think that's not the correct way to act morally. I think it is just as moral to call out the bad things that I'm responsible for as it is to call out the bad things that Genghis Khan did. Personally, I don't think that that's the case, but sure, okay, I can see that maybe somebody could put together a counter argument to make that case. And if you do have that counter argument, I'd love to hear from you. If you want to come on here and debate me with it, or have that discussion or conversation, we don't even have to go back and forth as a debate. We can just have a conversation about it. I'm happy to do it. Again, like I said, it's not my point of view, but that's the point of view. It's not simply America bad. But I think, just generally speaking, political life is mostly focused on people calling out the bad behavior of others, which is one of the reasons why so little effective change actually takes place, which makes it, to me, even less moral. All right. Those are my thoughts on that. Thank you very much for watching. As I say, if you like the things that we do here, please feel free to like the video. Please feel free to like the podcast, the audio version. That's all I have to say. Thanks so much for watching. Take care. Have a good one. Bye-bye.